Truth is rarely where people think it is. Most human beings live on the surface of reality, mistaking appearance for essence, shadow for substance. What we call the world is often nothing more than a thin layer of perception covering something far deeper. Philosophy begins precisely at that fracture. It begins the moment a human being dares to ask a dangerous question. What if everything I see is only the echo of something more real? Long before modern psychology tried to analyze the human mind, long before the language of cognitive bias or perception even existed, one thinker had already confronted this unsettling possibility. In ancient Greece, Plato proposed a radical idea. The world of objects around us is not the ultimate reality. It is only a reflection, a copy. The visible world is a surface, while truth lives in a deeper order that the senses cannot fully grasp. As described in the philosophical framework outlined in the text, Plato believed that philosophy is not simply intellectual curiosity. It is the turning of the soul toward what is real. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Yet Plato's philosophy is not comfortable. It confronts us. It strips away certainty. If what we perceive is only a shadow, then what does it mean to truly know? And if truth lies beyond appearances, who among us is willing to leave the familiar darkness behind? To understand this, we must begin where Plato himself begins, with a radical claim about reality itself. The world we see is not the real world. The real world is something the mind must struggle to reach. Reality is not what the eyes report. The visible world is only the skin of existence, not its core. What we touch, measure, and chase every day is merely a surface copy of something deeper, colder, and far more permanent. The greatest philosophical shock is not discovering a new object in the world. It is discovering that the world itself may not be the true thing. Long before modern science tried to map the universe, and long before psychology tried to map the mind, one thinker had already placed a blade against human certainty. That thinker was Plato. In a time when most people trusted what they saw, he suspected the opposite. He suspected that sight itself might be the most sophisticated illusion humanity lives inside. The claim is brutal. The physical world is not ultimate reality. It is a shadow of something more perfect, something unchanging, something the senses cannot reach. Plato called these deeper realities forms, perfect structures of truth that exist beyond matter, beyond time, beyond decay. The table you see is not the real table. The real table exists as an eternal idea. The physical table is only an imperfect imitation. This claim immediately confronts the human instinct to trust the senses. We live through sight, sound, and touch. Our daily decisions depend on them. Yet Plato forces a disturbing question. What if the senses are not windows to truth, but filters that distort it? To understand his argument, we must strip away a common misunderstanding. Many imagine that Plato simply disliked the physical world. That is not the point. The world is not false in the sense of being non-existent. It exists. But it exists as a copy, a temporary expression of a deeper pattern. Consider something simple: beauty. Every culture recognizes beauty, yet no physical object fully contains it. A beautiful face ages. A beautiful building erodes. A beautiful melody fades after the last note. Every physical example of beauty is incomplete and temporary. Yet, the idea of beauty itself feels stable, almost eternal. Plato isolates this paradox. The world constantly changes, but the ideas we use to judge the world do not change in the same way. Justice remains justice, even when societies collapse. Equality remains equality, even when laws distort it. The triangle remains a triangle, even when no perfect triangle can be drawn in the material world. From this observation emerges the first branch of Plato's argument. The physical world is a world of copies. Everything we see participates in a deeper structure it cannot perfectly embody. A circle drawn on paper is never perfectly round. The ink spreads. The line trembles. The surface distorts. Yet the concept of a perfect circle exists clearly in the mind. The mind can grasp what the hand cannot produce. The senses show us imperfect circles. Reason grasps the perfect one. This difference is not trivial. It reveals a hierarchy of reality. The objects of sense belong to a lower level of existence because they constantly change. They decay. They break. They transform. But the forms remain stable. They do not age. They do not erode. They simply are. Here, Plato exposes a truth that most people resist confronting. Change is the signature of imperfection. Anything that changes cannot be ultimate. A second branch of the argument cuts even deeper. Truth does not originate in the senses. It originates in reason. The senses flood us with information, but information is not knowledge. We see countless objects, yet we must interpret them. We hear countless voices, yet we must judge which voice speaks truth. The senses deliver fragments. Reason organizes them into understanding. Plato pushes this further. He argues that genuine knowledge must concern what is stable. If knowledge is about something that constantly changes, then knowledge would dissolve as quickly as the object changes. True knowledge must therefore concern something permanent. Forms provide that permanence. The form of justice does not change when governments change. The form of beauty does not disappear when a flower withers. The form of equality does not vanish when societies fail to live by it. Through this reasoning, Plato draws a line between two kinds of cognition: opinion and knowledge. Opinion depends on perception and fluctuates with appearances. Knowledge depends on rational insight and remains anchored in the structure of reality itself. Many people misunderstand this distinction. They believe belief and knowledge differ only in confidence. Plato disagrees. The difference is structural. Belief looks outward to the senses. Knowledge looks inward through reason. This is why philosophy, in Plato's view, is not intellectual decoration. It is liberation. The philosopher trains the mind to turn away from appearances and toward the patterns that govern them. But this philosophical move is not comfortable. It destabilizes everyday certainty. If the senses cannot deliver ultimate truth, then much of what we rely on becomes fragile. The world begins to look less like a solid ground and more like a moving reflection. This realization carries enormous psychological weight. Human beings crave stability. We want reality to be simple and visible. We want truth to sit directly in front of us, something we can point at and say, there it is. Plato denies that comfort. He demands that truth be pursued through intellectual struggle. And this demand places a burden on the human soul. Because the soul senses the gap between appearances and reality long before it understands it. We feel it whenever something beautiful fades. We feel it whenever justice fails in the world. We feel it whenever a perfect idea collapses under imperfect execution. There is always a silent comparison happening inside the mind. The comparison between what is and what should be. That comparison reveals the shadow of the forms. The modern world often assumes it has moved beyond Plato. Technology surrounds us. Data fills our screens. The material world appears more measurable than ever. Yet the ancient problem has not disappeared. In many ways, it has intensified. Modern life multiplies appearances, images, simulations, digital identities, algorithmic realities. The surface of the world grows thicker and more convincing. Yet beneath this surface, the hunger for something real becomes stronger. People speak constantly about authenticity. They search for meaning. They question whether the lives displayed online reflect any deeper truth. These questions echo the same tension Plato described thousands of years ago. Even today, we suspect that what we see may not be the deepest layer of reality. Modernity did not eliminate illusion. It industrialized it. And this is where the psychological dimension of Plato's insight becomes unavoidable. The human mind lives between two worlds, the world of appearances and the world of meaning. The senses drag us toward the visible. Reason pulls us toward the invisible structure beneath it. This tension produces a quiet anxiety inside consciousness. We sense that our lives are shaped by patterns we do not fully see. We sense that truth requires effort, discipline, and intellectual courage. And yet the comfort of appearances constantly seduces us back into passive perception. The struggle is not simply philosophical. It is existential. To seek truth means refusing to accept the world exactly as it appears. Plato illustrates this tension indirectly through the figure of the philosopher. The philosopher is not defined by intelligence alone. The philosopher is defined by orientation. While most people focus on objects, the philosopher focuses on patterns. While most people trust perception, the philosopher interrogates it. This difference creates distance. Philosophers often appear strange to their societies because they refuse to treat appearances as final. Through this figure, Plato reveals a deeper truth about human nature. The search for truth isolates the seeker because confronting the possibility that reality is deeper than it appears destabilizes ordinary life. It forces questions that many would prefer to avoid. Questions about justice, beauty, truth, and the meaning of existence itself. Yet the mind cannot permanently ignore these questions. They return in moments of crisis. They return in moments of wonder. They return whenever the world reveals its instability. A beautiful building collapses. A political system fails. A life carefully planned falls apart. Suddenly, appearances lose their authority. Suddenly, the mind asks what remains when the surface disappears. This is where Plato's insight becomes unavoidable. If reality were only material, meaning would dissolve with every change. But the mind continues searching for stable principles. It continues searching for justice, even in unjust societies. It continues searching for beauty, even in decay. The mind behaves as if something permanent exists. Plato gives a name to that permanence: forms. They are not objects floating in a distant universe. They are the structural truths that make understanding possible at all. Without them, the world would collapse into chaos of impressions, with no order, no judgment, no meaning. Through reason, the soul slowly aligns itself with these structures. This alignment is not immediate. It requires questioning assumptions, examining beliefs, and resisting the hypnotic authority of appearances. Philosophy becomes a training of perception itself, a turning of the mind toward deeper patterns. But the more clearly the mind begins to suspect that appearances are only shadows, the more unsettling the world becomes. Because if what we see is not the ultimate layer of reality, then a deeper question emerges with disturbing force. If these objects are shadows, what is casting them? And once that question awakens inside the mind, the surface of the world no longer feels stable. It begins to look like the wall of a cave where shapes move, but their true sources remain hidden somewhere beyond the light. Human beings rarely see reality. They see shadows and mistake them for truth. The mind clings to appearances because appearances are comfortable, predictable, and easy to understand. But beneath this comfort lies a dangerous illusion. What we call reality is often only the projection of something deeper, something hidden behind the surface of perception. This is the next blade Plato drives into human certainty. If the visible world is only a copy of deeper forms, then the human condition becomes more disturbing than we expected. We are not simply observers of reality. We are prisoners inside a system of appearances that constantly disguises the truth. To reveal this condition, Plato introduces one of the most powerful images in the entire history of philosophy, an image that strips human confidence down to its bones, the image of the cave. Long before modern psychology studied cognitive bias, and long before technology created digital illusions that flood modern life, Plato had already exposed the structure of human misunderstanding. He imagined humanity living inside a cave, chained since birth, forced to look only at a wall in front of them. Behind them burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners move objects carried by unseen figures. These objects cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners cannot turn their heads. They cannot see the fire. They cannot see the objects creating the shadows. The only thing they have ever known is the moving shapes on the cave wall. For them, the shadows are reality. This image is not a metaphor for ignorance alone. It is a diagnosis of the human condition. The first claim hidden inside the cave is brutal. Human perception is easily deceived. When people grow up surrounded by appearances, they stop questioning them. Familiarity replaces truth. Habit replaces understanding. The prisoners in the cave do not doubt the shadows because the shadows have always been there. They organize their understanding around them. They name them. They categorize them. They even compete with each other to interpret them. In other words, they build an entire culture around illusions. Plato is not describing a distant primitive society. He is describing us. The mind prefers stability over truth. If an illusion remains consistent long enough, the mind accepts it as reality. This psychological mechanism protects us from chaos, but it also traps us inside simplified interpretations of the world. The second claim in the cave cuts deeper. Society often reinforces illusion rather than challenging it. Inside the cave, the prisoners form a shared agreement about the shadows. They create language for them. They reward those who predict the movement of the shadows accurately. They admire those who appear most knowledgeable about them. Yet none of this knowledge concerns reality itself. It concerns only the patterns of illusion. This observation is profoundly unsettling because it suggests that entire social systems can operate within a mistaken framework without realizing it. A society can become highly organized while remaining fundamentally disconnected from truth. Plato is not attacking knowledge. He is attacking misplaced certainty. Human beings often confuse familiarity with understanding. When many people share the same belief, it begins to feel reliable. But popularity does not transform illusion into truth. The cave reveals that collective agreement can coexist with collective misunderstanding. Now imagine something disturbing happening inside this cave. One prisoner breaks free. At first, freedom does not feel like liberation. It feels like pain. The prisoner turns around for the first time and sees the fire. The light burns his eyes. The shadows he once trusted begin to look distorted. The objects casting them appear unfamiliar and confusing. His entire understanding collapses. This moment reveals another psychological truth Plato understood with brutal clarity. The discovery of truth is rarely comfortable. It destabilizes the mind before it enlightens it. The human psyche resists radical revision of its beliefs. When a deeply held assumption breaks apart, the mind experiences confusion, anxiety, even anger. This is why many people defend illusions long after evidence challenges them. The freed prisoner now faces a second stage of transformation. He leaves the cave and steps into the outside world. At first, he sees nothing clearly. The sunlight overwhelms him. Gradually, his vision adjusts. He begins to see reflections in water, then objects themselves, then eventually the sky, the stars, and finally the sun. In Plato's philosophy, the sun represents the highest principle of truth, the source that makes understanding possible. The journey from shadow to sunlight is not simply an intellectual process. It is a transformation of perception itself. The mind must relearn how to see. Here, Plato reveals the essence of philosophy. Philosophy is not the accumulation of information. It is the painful reorientation of the soul. The philosopher is the one who turns around. While others continue watching the wall of shadows, the philosopher asks the forbidden question: what if what we see is not the whole story? What if the structure producing these appearances lies somewhere behind us? But the story does not end with enlightenment. The freed prisoner eventually returns to the cave. This return exposes the most tragic dimension of the allegory. When the enlightened prisoner tries to explain the outside world to those still chained, they cannot understand him. His eyes, now adjusted to sunlight, struggle to see clearly in the darkness. The other prisoners interpret this as weakness. They laugh at him. To them, leaving the cave appears dangerous and foolish. If anyone attempted to free them, they might even respond with hostility. Plato is describing a recurring pattern in human history. Those who challenge deeply rooted illusions often encounter resistance rather than gratitude. The mind protects its worldview like a fortress. New truths threaten that structure. They introduce uncertainty. They demand change. And change frightens the human psyche. The cave therefore reveals three layers of human existence. First, the layer of illusion, where appearances dominate perception. Second, the moment of awakening, where truth begins to destabilize familiar beliefs. Third, the responsibility of returning, where the awakened mind confronts the resistance of society. This structure remains visible in the modern world. In the era of 2025, humanity possesses more information than any civilization before it. Screens glow in every room. Data travels across the planet in seconds. Yet, information does not guarantee clarity. If anything, the cave has become more complex. Images circulate faster than understanding. Narratives spread before they are examined. Algorithms amplify what is emotionally compelling rather than what is intellectually accurate. The shadows on the wall have multiplied. People debate interpretations of these shadows with intense conviction. Entire identities form around them. Yet beneath this endless activity, the deeper philosophical question remains unchanged. Are we looking at reality, or are we looking at projections created by forces we barely understand? Plato's cave becomes even more disturbing when we examine the psychology behind it. Why do people remain in the cave even when the possibility of a larger world exists? The answer lies in fear. Truth demands transformation. Illusion demands nothing. Illusion allows life to continue without disruption. It allows beliefs to remain stable. It allows identity to remain intact. Leaving the cave means abandoning certainty. This psychological resistance explains why intellectual courage is rare. Most people prefer predictable shadows to uncertain light. The mind negotiates with comfort long before it commits to truth. And yet something inside the human soul continues to resist the cave. We experience it in moments of doubt, moments when familiar explanations no longer feel sufficient, moments when the patterns of the world begin to look incomplete. The mind starts asking deeper questions. What is real? What is merely appearance? What is knowledge? These questions cannot be avoided forever, because once the suspicion arises that appearances might conceal something deeper, the structure of understanding begins to shift. The mind starts distinguishing between two types of cognition, one that depends on perception and one that demands comprehension of underlying reality. This distinction becomes the next battlefield of Plato's philosophy. Because the shadows in the cave do not only represent illusion, they also represent a more subtle danger, the danger of confusing belief with knowledge. Belief is not knowledge. The human mind confuses the two constantly, and from that confusion, entire civilizations construct their confidence. People defend opinions with the same intensity they should reserve for truth. Yet Plato exposes a brutal distinction. To believe something is easy. To know something requires penetrating the structure of reality itself. This distinction emerges precisely where the cave leaves us. The prisoners inside the cave hold countless beliefs about the shadows on the wall. They debate them. They interpret them. They build reputations around predicting them. But none of these beliefs touch the source of the shadows. Their entire intellectual world floats on the surface of illusion. Plato's insight is merciless. Opinion lives close to appearances. Knowledge lives close to reality. Long before modern epistemology existed, and long before scientific methodology attempted to separate evidence from assumption, Plato had already mapped the terrain of human cognition. He understood that the mind does not operate on a single level of understanding. It moves through layers. Each layer represents a deeper contact with truth. This is why Plato introduces another image, quieter than the cave, but equally precise: the image of the divided line. Imagine a line split into segments, each segment representing a level of awareness. At the lowest level lie images and reflections, shadows, mirrors, distortions. These are the weakest forms of cognition because they rely entirely on appearance. A reflection of an object is already a copy of a copy. It contains the least stability. Above this level lies belief tied to physical objects. Here, the mind observes the world directly: trees, stones, bodies, buildings. This level feels solid because it deals with things we can touch, yet it still belongs to the realm of change. Objects decay, structures collapse, bodies age. Perception remains vulnerable to error. Above these layers lies something radically different: thought that no longer depends on sensory objects, but on reasoning itself. Mathematics lives here. The mind works with structures that do not change simply because the physical world changes. A triangle drawn on paper may distort, but the properties of a triangle remain stable within reasoning. At the highest level stands direct understanding of the forms themselves, pure intellectual insight into the patterns that govern reality, justice itself, beauty itself, truth itself. Through this structure, Plato reveals the architecture of knowledge. The human mind climbs from appearance toward essence. The critical point here is not simply that knowledge exists. It is that knowledge requires discipline. The mind must learn to distrust its first impressions. It must learn to question the images that flood perception. Most people stop at the level of belief. They see an event and form an interpretation. They hear an argument and adopt a position. They absorb narratives from their culture and repeat them as if they were truths. This process feels natural because it requires little effort. The mind prefers shortcuts. It prefers quick explanations. But Plato insists that genuine knowledge cannot rely on convenience. To know something means to grasp why it must be the way it is. Consider a simple example. A person may believe that justice means obeying the law. That belief may feel stable within a society, yet laws change. Some laws protect freedom, while others enforce oppression. If justice simply meant obedience to law, then justice would transform every time a government rewrote legislation. But our intuition rebels against that conclusion. We sense that justice must be something deeper than the shifting rules of a society. We suspect there is a structure underlying the idea itself, something that allows us to judge laws rather than simply obey them. That deeper structure is what Plato calls the form of justice. Belief describes how things appear within a given context. Knowledge searches for the principle that remains valid across contexts. This distinction forces a confrontation with intellectual humility. Most of what people defend in daily life belongs to the level of opinion. Political views, social assumptions, cultural narratives. They often emerge from incomplete information combined with emotional attachment. Yet they are held with absolute confidence. Plato would diagnose this as a cognitive illusion. The mind mistakes familiarity for understanding. This psychological mechanism becomes even more visible in the modern era. In the world of 2025, information travels at extraordinary speed. Opinions circulate instantly. Millions of people comment on events before those events are fully understood. Speed replaces reflection. The result is a culture saturated with belief, but starved of knowledge. People scroll through headlines, absorb fragments of information, and form conclusions within seconds. Algorithms amplify emotionally charged content because emotion drives engagement. The mind receives stimulation, but not depth. The shadows on the wall of the cave have become interactive. Yet Plato's ancient warning remains untouched by time. Exposure to information does not produce wisdom. In fact, the constant flow of impressions can reinforce superficial thinking. The mind becomes addicted to quick interpretations rather than patient investigation. Knowledge requires something far rarer than information. It requires intellectual courage. To move from belief to knowledge means questioning assumptions that feel comfortable. It means suspending judgment long enough to examine the foundations of a claim. It means resisting the instinct to defend an opinion simply because it belongs to our identity. This process destabilizes the ego because beliefs are rarely neutral. They attach themselves to personal identity, social belonging, and emotional security. When a belief collapses, the individual does not simply lose an idea. They lose a piece of their psychological stability. This is why the transition from opinion to knowledge often provokes resistance. The mind defends its beliefs not only because it thinks they are true, but because they maintain coherence within the self. Plato recognized this tension long before modern psychology named it. He understood that the pursuit of truth demands an inner struggle. The soul must detach itself from the comfort of appearances and turn toward rational inquiry. This turning is not automatic. It must be trained. Children naturally ask questions about the world. But as individuals grow older, social systems begin rewarding certainty more than curiosity. People gain status by sounding confident. Doubt begins to look like weakness. Over time, the questioning instinct weakens. Belief solidifies into dogma. Philosophy attempts to reverse this process. The philosopher reawakens the questioning mind. Instead of accepting the first explanation offered by society, the philosopher demands justification. Instead of repeating inherited opinions, The philosopher investigates their foundations. This is why Plato places such importance on rational structure. Reason is not simply a tool for solving practical problems. It is the instrument that allows the soul to climb from opinion toward knowledge. Without reason, the mind remains trapped inside interpretation. But even reason must be used carefully. Reason can become another servant of belief if it is used merely to defend predetermined conclusions. True reasoning does something more dangerous. It examines whether the conclusion itself deserves to survive. This is where the philosophical method begins to sharpen, because once the mind accepts that belief and knowledge are fundamentally different, a new demand emerges. The mind must learn how to move between these levels. It must develop a process capable of testing claims, revealing contradictions, and uncovering deeper principles. Plato understood that this process cannot occur in isolation. The mind discovers its errors most effectively through confrontation with other minds. When ideas collide, weaknesses appear, assumptions surface, hidden contradictions reveal themselves. Through disciplined dialogue, belief begins to dissolve and knowledge begins to form. But this method requires patience, humility, and intellectual honesty. It requires participants willing to expose their own thinking to examination. And this willingness is rare because it threatens the ego. Most conversations aim to win rather than to understand. Plato demands something harsher. He demands a dialogue that strips away illusion. The philosopher must ask questions that penetrate beneath the surface of belief, questions that force the mind to examine the logic behind its claims, questions that reveal whether an idea stands on solid ground or on hidden contradictions. This method does not merely collect answers, it dismantles illusions. And once the mind becomes accustomed to this relentless examination, belief begins to lose its authority. The thinker no longer accepts statements simply because they sound convincing. The thinker begins searching for the underlying structure that makes a statement necessarily true. This transformation leads directly to the most powerful intellectual weapon Plato ever articulated, a method that does not simply gather information, but cuts through confusion. A method that turns questioning itself into an instrument of liberation. Because when the mind finally learns how to question with precision, the walls of the cave begin to crack from within. Truth does not reveal itself to passive minds. It must be hunted, cornered, and forced into the light through relentless questioning. The human mind does not drift naturally toward clarity. It drifts toward comfort. That is why Plato insists that the path from belief to knowledge cannot rely on observation alone. It demands a disciplined confrontation with ideas themselves. This confrontation is what Plato calls dialectic. Long before formal logic systems existed, and long before universities institutionalized philosophical debate, Plato had already identified the most dangerous tool the human mind could wield. Not the accumulation of information, not the authority of tradition. The weapon is the question. A true philosophical question does not decorate a conversation. It exposes the weakness inside an assumption. This insight comes directly from the figure who stands behind almost every dialogue Plato ever wrote, Socrates. A man who possessed no written doctrine, no grand institutional power, and no political authority. Yet his methods shattered the intellectual confidence of an entire city. While the citizens of Athens believed they understood justice, virtue, courage, and knowledge, Socrates asked them a simple demand: define it. At first, the request sounded harmless. People responded quickly. Justice is obeying the law. Courage is fighting bravely. Virtue is doing good. But Socrates did not stop at the first answer. He pressed deeper. If justice is obeying the law, what happens when the law is unjust? If courage is fighting bravely, what about the reckless soldier who rushes into battle without wisdom? If virtue is doing good, what is good itself? Every answer triggered another question. Slowly, the structure of confident beliefs began to collapse. This is the essence of dialectic. It strips away the illusion that vague words represent understanding. It forces the mind to confront its own contradictions. Most people do not realize how fragile their beliefs are until they attempt to explain them clearly. Language hides confusion behind familiar terms. Words like justice, freedom, truth, morality circulate constantly in conversation. Yet when examined closely, their meanings often dissolve into uncertainty. Dialectic refuses to tolerate that uncertainty. The process unfolds in layers. First, a claim is presented. Someone asserts that they understand a concept. Then, questioning begins. Each answer is examined for logical consistency. If a contradiction appears, the claim must be revised. If the revision introduces another contradiction, the process continues. The goal is not humiliation. The goal is purification of thought. Through repeated questioning, weak ideas collapse. What survives the process grows sharper, more precise, and more resilient. The mind begins moving away from superficial opinion and towards structured understanding. This process is uncomfortable by design because the ego does not enjoy discovering that its beliefs are poorly constructed. The moment a contradiction appears, the mind instinctively tries to defend itself. People change definitions mid-argument. They appeal to emotion. They attack the questioner. Socrates encountered this reaction constantly. Athens admired rhetoric. Skilled speakers could persuade large crowds. They could win debates through charisma and clever language. But Socrates revealed that persuasion is not the same as truth. A statement can sound convincing and still collapse under examination. This revelation threatened the intellectual culture of the city. Sophists taught people how to win arguments. Socrates taught people how to expose them. And this distinction explains why philosophy, in Plato's understanding, is fundamentally different from ordinary discussion. Ordinary discussion often seeks agreement or victory. Dialectic seeks truth, even if that truth humiliates the participants. To pursue dialectic requires a psychological transformation. The thinker must become willing to sacrifice pride for clarity. The mind must accept that being wrong is not a failure, but a necessary stage in approaching understanding. This is where philosophy becomes an ethical discipline. The pursuit of truth demands intellectual honesty. The thinker must refuse the temptation to defend beliefs simply because they are familiar. Instead, every claim must stand before reason like a suspect under interrogation. What evidence supports it? What assumptions hide beneath it? What contradictions weaken it? The dialectical method demands answers. Plato sees this process as a form of liberation. Inside the cave, prisoners interpret shadows without ever questioning the source of those shadows. Their discussions remain trapped within appearances. Dialectic forces the mind to turn around. It demands investigation of the causes behind what is visible. Instead of asking, "What do we see?" the philosopher asks, "Why must it be this way?" This shift from description to explanation marks the birth of philosophical reason. Once the mind begins operating in this mode, it becomes impossible to return fully to passive belief. The thinker starts noticing contradictions everywhere. Political rhetoric becomes transparent. Cultural assumptions become questionable. Even personal beliefs begin to look unstable. The world becomes intellectually alive. Yet this awakening brings a burden, because questioning everything can isolate the thinker from the surrounding culture. Most societies reward conformity of belief more than depth of understanding. Those who ask disruptive questions often appear difficult or even dangerous. Socrates himself paid the ultimate price for this tension. Athens accused him of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the city's traditions. In reality, his crime was far more unsettling. He taught young minds to question authority, and authority rarely welcomes examination. The death of Socrates becomes a philosophical warning. Societies that fear questioning eventually protect illusion more fiercely than truth. Plato never forgot this lesson. His philosophical system therefore treats dialectic not merely as a method, but as the highest intellectual discipline. It is the tool that allows the mind to ascend toward the forms. Without dialectic, reason remains trapped at the level of assumptions. Through dialectic, the mind climbs toward clarity. The process resembles a sculptor removing excess stone. Each question chips away at confusion. Each contradiction removes a fragment of illusion. Slowly, the structure of a concept emerges with sharper edges. Justice begins to reveal its structure. Truth begins to reveal its necessity. Knowledge begins to separate itself from opinion. Yet dialectic also reveals something even more unsettling about human nature. Many people do not actually want truth. They want confirmation. They want their beliefs reinforced, not examined. They want conversations that affirm identity rather than challenge it. This psychological preference explains why ideological conflicts escalate so easily. When beliefs become part of personal identity, questioning them feels like a personal attack. The dialectical philosopher refuses that comfort. Truth must survive scrutiny. If an idea collapses under questioning, it deserves to collapse. This attitude requires courage. To question deeply is to risk discovering that entire sections of one's worldview are built on unstable foundations. It means accepting intellectual vulnerability. It means acknowledging ignorance where certainty once stood. Yet Plato insists that this vulnerability is the beginning of wisdom. The mind that admits ignorance becomes capable of learning. The mind that pretends certainty remains trapped inside its own illusions. In the modern world, this lesson has become even more urgent. The year 2025 is saturated with voices competing for attention. Opinions circulate through digital networks at relentless speed. People debate politics, morality, science, and identity every day. But the form of these debates often resembles the prisoners arguing about shadows. Each side defends its interpretation. Few ask whether the interpretation itself rests on a fragile assumption. Dialectic demands a different approach. It slows the conversation. It asks participants to define their terms. It traces the logical consequences of their claims. It refuses emotional shortcuts. Under its pressure, vague language begins to fracture. What remains is either genuine understanding or honest confusion. Both are preferable to illusion. But dialectic does not end with dismantling beliefs. Its ultimate purpose is constructive. Once contradictions are removed, the mind becomes capable of seeing the underlying structure that organizes reality. Patterns emerge. Connections appear. The thinker begins perceiving that ideas are not isolated fragments, but parts of a larger order. Concepts like justice, virtue, knowledge, and harmony begin to relate to each other within a coherent framework. This realization brings Plato to a new question. If reason can uncover the structure of ideas, what happens when those ideas are applied to human life itself? What happens when the same search for order is directed toward society, toward morality, toward the inner structure of the human soul? Because once the mind begins examining the nature of justice, not merely as an abstract concept, but as a living force inside both the individual and the state, an even deeper philosophical problem emerges. What does it actually mean for a human life to be just? Justice is not a rule written on paper. It is a structure written into the soul. Human societies often believe justice begins in courts, laws, and institutions. But Plato cuts through this assumption with ruthless precision. Justice does not originate in the state. It originates inside the human being. A society can never be just if the souls of its citizens remain divided against themselves. This claim shifts the entire conversation. The question is no longer simply how laws should be written. The deeper question emerges immediately. What kind of inner order must exist inside a human mind for justice to become possible at all? Plato begins his investigation by stripping away a popular illusion. Many people believe justice means giving people what they deserve, or obeying the laws of the city. These definitions appear sensible at first glance, yet when examined carefully, they collapse under pressure. A law can command injustice. History is filled with legal systems that protected tyranny. If obedience alone defined justice, then obedience to oppression would become virtuous. The mind revolts against that conclusion. Something deeper must determine whether a law itself is just. Others argue that justice means helping friends and harming enemies. But this idea also fractures under scrutiny. People often misjudge who their friends and enemies truly are. More importantly, harming another person tends to damage the moral character of the one who commits the harm. If justice makes the soul worse, it cannot truly be justice. Through these dismantled definitions, Plato exposes a crucial insight. Justice cannot be defined through external behavior alone. It must refer to an inner condition. To discover this condition, Plato performs an intellectual maneuver that reveals the architecture of both society and the soul at the same time. He suggests that the structure of a city mirrors the structure of the human mind. By examining justice in the city, we may understand justice within the individual. A city functions through different roles. Farmers produce food. Builders construct houses. Soldiers defend the community. Leaders make decisions. Each role performs a distinct function necessary for the survival of the whole. When each group performs its role properly, and does not interfere with the function of others, the city operates smoothly. Production continues. Defense remains stable. Governance maintains order. Harmony appears. But when roles become confused, the system collapses. If those driven by appetite attempt to rule, chaos follows. If those trained only for combat attempt to govern, violence replaces wisdom. Disorder spreads because the structure of the city has been broken. From this observation, Plato extracts a powerful principle. Justice is harmony between parts performing their proper function. This principle does not remain confined to politics. It reaches directly into the human psyche, because the human soul also contains multiple forces. Desires pull the individual toward pleasure and comfort. Emotional energy pushes toward ambition, pride, and honor. Reason seeks understanding and long-term truth. These forces rarely move in perfect alignment. Desire wants immediate satisfaction. Anger wants victory. Pride wants recognition. Reason wants coherence and wisdom. When these forces compete for dominance, the soul becomes unstable. Decisions become impulsive. Judgment becomes distorted. This internal conflict is the birthplace of injustice. A person dominated by appetite sacrifices long-term well-being for short bursts of pleasure. A person dominated by pride sacrifices wisdom for recognition. A person ruled by anger sacrifices justice for revenge. In each case, one part of the soul attempts to rule where it does not belong. Plato therefore identifies justice not as a behavior, but as an arrangement. The rational part of the soul must govern. The spirited part must support that governance with courage and discipline. The appetites must accept guidance rather than dictate action. When this internal hierarchy stabilizes, the human being becomes integrated. Desires remain present but controlled. Emotions remain powerful but directed. Reason provides orientation. Harmony appears within the individual just as it appears within a well-ordered city. This idea overturns many common assumptions about morality. Most people think justice means obeying rules imposed from outside. Plato argues that external rules are secondary. Without internal harmony, those rules remain fragile. A person who obeys laws only out of fear remains internally chaotic. True justice exists when the soul organizes itself according to reason. The implications of this claim extend far beyond politics. A human life without inner order becomes restless. Desires multiply endlessly. Achievements fail to produce satisfaction. Emotional reactions dominate decisions. The person moves constantly, but never feels stable. Plato sees this condition everywhere in human experience. People chase wealth, believing it will bring fulfillment. They chase status, believing recognition will quiet their insecurities. They chase pleasure, believing stimulation will dissolve dissatisfaction. Yet these pursuits often intensify the problem rather than solving it. Because without internal harmony, the soul cannot digest what it obtains. Achievements become temporary distractions rather than lasting meaning. Desire continues expanding. The individual becomes a battlefield where impulses fight for control. Modern life in the era of 2025 intensifies this fragmentation. Technology accelerates stimulation. Images of success circulate endlessly. Social comparison becomes constant. Every screen invites the mind to desire something new. Attention fractures. Desire multiplies faster than reflection. In such an environment, the Platonic warning becomes almost prophetic. A society overflowing with stimulation can still produce individuals starving for inner order. External abundance does not repair internal chaos. The human soul remains vulnerable to imbalance, regardless of material progress. This is why Plato connects justice directly to psychological health. A just person is not merely morally correct. A just person is internally coherent. The parts of the soul cooperate rather than compete. This cooperation produces a unique kind of stability. Reason guides decisions with long-term perspective. Courage supports reason by resisting fear and pressure. Desire becomes disciplined rather than suppressed. The individual becomes capable of acting consistently across situations. Such a person does not require constant external supervision. Their inner structure provides guidance. Justice becomes self-sustaining. But Plato also recognizes that achieving this harmony is extraordinarily difficult. Because the forces inside the soul rarely submit easily. Desire demands satisfaction. Pride demands recognition. Anger demands retaliation. Each force presents its demand as urgent and necessary. Reason must struggle constantly to maintain balance. This struggle explains why ethical life cannot be reduced to simple rules. Justice requires training. Just as a city requires education for its guardians and leaders, the soul requires cultivation of discipline and reflection. Without education, the rational element weakens. The louder forces of appetite and emotion take control. And once those forces dominate, both the individual and the society begin drifting toward disorder. The structure of the city reflects the structure of its citizens. If citizens pursue pleasure without discipline, the political system becomes corrupted by greed. If citizens pursue honor without wisdom, politics becomes a battlefield of ambition. If reason loses authority within the soul, leadership becomes unstable. Plato therefore reaches a startling conclusion. The fate of justice in society depends on the condition of the human soul. No constitution can permanently protect a community whose citizens lack inner harmony. Laws may restrain behavior temporarily, but they cannot manufacture wisdom. Only the cultivation of the soul can produce citizens capable of sustaining justice. This insight transforms the entire project of political philosophy. The central problem is no longer simply how to organize institutions. The deeper problem becomes how to shape the character of the human mind itself. Because if justice begins inside the individual, the next question becomes unavoidable. What forces actually compose the soul that must be brought into harmony? The human soul is not a single voice. It is a battlefield of forces pulling in different directions. Most people imagine the self as unified, a single decision maker calmly choosing a path. Plato rejects this comforting illusion. The soul is divided. Its internal tensions shape every decision, every ambition, every failure. Justice cannot be understood until this division is exposed. Plato cuts into the human psyche and reveals three fundamental forces operating within it. Not metaphors, not poetic language, but structural elements of consciousness itself. Each force seeks something different. Each force believes its desire should dominate the rest. Reason searches for truth. Spirit searches for honor. Appetite searches for pleasure. These three forces do not exist peacefully by default. They compete. Reason looks toward understanding. It wants coherence, knowledge, and long-term orientation. It asks questions before acting. It examines consequences. It considers the shape of a life rather than the momentary impulse of a desire. But reason is not the loudest voice inside the soul. Appetite speaks first and often speaks the loudest. Appetite is the realm of hunger, thirst, physical pleasure, comfort, material acquisition. It does not ask philosophical questions. It asks a simpler one. What will satisfy me now? The demands of appetite are relentless because they renew themselves endlessly. Hunger returns every day. Desire never declares itself finished. Wealth invites the pursuit of more wealth. Pleasure demands repetition. Left unchecked, appetite expands without limit. Then there is the third force, spirit. Spirit is neither calm like reason, nor indulgent like appetite. It burns. It seeks recognition, dignity, victory, respect. When insulted, spirit reacts with anger. When challenged, it pushes toward confrontation. When honored, it fuels courage and ambition. Spirit is the force that drives soldiers into battle, leaders toward authority, competitors toward triumph. Each of these forces claims legitimacy. Appetite insists that pleasure is the natural goal of life. Spirit insists that honor and recognition define human worth. Reason insists that truth and understanding must guide action. The conflict between them defines the drama of human existence. Plato does not invent this conflict. He observes it inside everyday experience. A person resolves to follow reason and maintain discipline. Then appetite interrupts with temptation, or spirit erupts with pride or anger. The internal debate begins. Should the individual pursue immediate pleasure or long-term stability? Should they retaliate against an insult or restrain themselves? Should they pursue wealth even when it compromises integrity? These questions reveal the structure of the soul. A person who has promised to wake early for work may still remain in bed when appetite demands comfort. A person who knows revenge will damage relationships may still act when wounded pride ignites the spirit. Reason speaks, but it is often outnumbered. Plato therefore describes the soul not as a democracy, but as a hierarchy. Justice inside the individual requires proper leadership among these forces. Reason must rule. Spirit must support reason. Appetite must accept guidance. This structure is not arbitrary. Each force has a legitimate function when properly ordered. Appetite keeps the body alive and responsive to physical needs. Spirit provides courage and determination. Reason offers direction and understanding. The problem arises when these forces reverse their positions. When appetite takes command, the individual becomes enslaved to pleasure. Life turns into a sequence of cravings and temporary satisfactions. Long-term goals collapse under the pressure of immediate desire. When spirit takes command, the individual becomes obsessed with status, recognition, and victory. Pride begins dictating behavior. Anger becomes a frequent companion. The person lives constantly measuring themselves against others. Only when reason governs can the other forces operate without destroying balance. Reason does not eliminate appetite. It disciplines it. Reason does not extinguish spirit. It channels it toward constructive goals. Courage becomes the defender of wisdom rather than the servant of pride. This structure creates harmony inside the soul. But harmony is not automatic. Human beings are born with appetites already demanding satisfaction. Children seek pleasure instinctively. They resist discomfort. Discipline must be learned. Spirit emerges later through competition and social recognition. Pride begins shaping identity. Young minds seek approval, admiration, and victory. Reason develops even more slowly. It requires education, reflection, and exposure to complex ideas. Without guidance, it can remain weak. This developmental imbalance explains why inner disorder appears so frequently in human life. Desire and pride mature before wisdom. A young person can feel intense ambition long before they understand the consequences of their actions. They can chase pleasure before recognizing how habits shape character. Spirit and appetite surge forward while reason struggles to keep pace. The result is instability. Plato's psychology therefore places enormous importance on education and discipline. The soul must be trained to establish the proper hierarchy. Reason must be strengthened until it can guide the other forces. Without such cultivation, the soul becomes fragmented. One day appetite dominates, the next day pride dictates behavior. The individual becomes inconsistent, reactive, easily manipulated by circumstance. This instability extends beyond personal life. A society composed of internally chaotic individuals cannot produce stable institutions. Citizens driven primarily by appetite pursue wealth and pleasure without restraint. Citizens driven by spirit pursue power and prestige, even when it damages the community. The political structure becomes a mirror of the inner structure of its citizens. If appetite dominates the population, politics becomes corrupted by greed. Leaders compete for wealth and influence. Laws are shaped to protect consumption rather than justice. If spirit dominates, politics becomes a theater of rivalry. National pride, factional competition, and the pursuit of honor replace careful reasoning. Only when reason holds authority within the collective soul can a society approach genuine order. In the era of 2025, the tension between these forces has intensified dramatically. Technology feeds appetite with endless stimulation. Advertising amplifies desire. Entire industries exist to transform attention into consumption. The modern individual is surrounded by invitations to satisfy impulses instantly. Spirit is equally stimulated. Social media platforms transform recognition into a measurable currency. Approval arrives in the form of numbers, comments, and visibility. Pride becomes tied to digital validation. Meanwhile, reason struggles to maintain authority. The constant flood of stimulation fragments attention. Reflection becomes rare. Long-term thinking competes with the immediacy of endless distraction. Plato would recognize this imbalance immediately. A culture that continuously excites appetite and spirit while neglecting the cultivation of reason risks creating individuals who are permanently restless. They move from pleasure to recognition to new desire without achieving inner stability. The soul remains divided. Yet Plato does not treat this division as hopeless. The structure of the soul also reveals the path toward harmony. Reason can learn. Through study, questioning, and disciplined reflection, the rational part of the soul strengthens. It begins recognizing patterns within experience. It learns which pleasures lead to fulfillment and which lead to emptiness. It learns when pride becomes destructive. As reason gains clarity, spirit can become its ally. The energy of spirit provides courage to resist temptation and social pressure. Pride becomes commitment to integrity rather than hunger for applause. The spirited element becomes a guardian of the soul's order. Appetite also finds its place. Pleasure is no longer the ruler, but it remains a participant in life. Physical needs are satisfied without becoming tyrannical. Enjoyment exists without dominating purpose. The individual becomes integrated. Such a person no longer experiences life as a constant internal argument. Their desires align with their understanding. Their ambitions align with their values. Their emotions reinforce rather than sabotage their decisions. This condition represents justice within the soul. And once this internal structure appears, a deeper question naturally arises. If the parts of the soul must be harmonized to create a just individual, then what does such harmony reveal about the nature of virtue itself? Virtue is not moral decoration. It is the architecture of a stable soul. Most people speak of virtue as if it were a list of rules, a collection of behaviors that society praises and rewards. Plato cuts through that shallow understanding. Virtue is not obedience, it is harmony. A life becomes good only when the forces inside the soul align under the guidance of reason. This claim emerges naturally from the structure already revealed. If the human soul contains reason, spirit, and appetite, then the health of the soul depends on how these forces relate to one another. Virtue is not something added to the soul from the outside. It appears when the soul organizes itself correctly. Injustice fragments the self. Virtue integrates it. When appetite rules, the individual becomes enslaved to desire. When spirit rules, pride and anger distort judgment. But when reason holds authority, both spirit and appetite find their proper place. The soul becomes balanced. And from this balance, something remarkable emerges: happiness. Yet Plato refuses the modern misunderstanding of happiness as pleasure or emotional excitement. Happiness, in its deepest sense, is stability of the inner structure. A life that is internally ordered produces a quiet strength that pleasure alone cannot deliver. The modern world confuses stimulation with fulfillment. In the era of 2025, happiness is often marketed as a series of experiences. Travel more, buy more, achieve more recognition, collect moments that look impressive from the outside. But Plato sees through this illusion. A chaotic soul can accumulate endless experiences and still remain restless. Pleasure arrives and disappears. Recognition appears and fades. Desire is satisfied and immediately replaced by a new desire. The individual keeps moving, yet never arrives anywhere stable. Virtue interrupts this cycle. When reason governs the soul, the individual stops chasing every impulse that appears. Decisions begin to reflect a larger structure. The person asks not only what feels good now, but what strengthens the integrity of a life. This shift changes everything. Appetite no longer dictates action. Instead, it becomes moderated. Food, comfort, and pleasure remain part of existence, but they do not dominate it. The individual enjoys them without becoming dependent on them. Spirit also changes its role. Instead of demanding constant recognition, it begins supporting discipline. Pride transforms into self-respect, grounded in integrity. Courage becomes the strength to defend what reason recognizes as right. Through this alignment, the soul stops fighting itself. This is the core of virtue, harmony. But harmony is not softness. It requires discipline and continuous attention. The forces inside the soul never disappear. Appetite still whispers. Pride still flares. Anger still erupts. Virtue means these forces are guided rather than suppressed or obeyed blindly. Plato sees virtue as the health of the soul, in the same way physical health represents balance within the body. A healthy body functions smoothly because its systems cooperate. The heart, lungs, and muscles perform their roles without interfering with each other. When imbalance appears, illness emerges. The soul behaves the same way. When appetite overwhelms reason, addiction appears. When pride overwhelms judgment, arrogance appears. When anger overwhelms reflection, violence appears. These are not simply moral failures. They are symptoms of inner disorder. Virtue restores order. This understanding also explains why injustice damages the person who commits it. At first glance, injustice may appear profitable. A person may gain wealth through deception or power through manipulation. From the outside, such victories can look impressive. But Plato argues that injustice always corrupts the soul of the one who practices it. Because to act unjustly means allowing appetite or pride to override reason. Each unjust act strengthens the dominance of these forces. Over time, the rational part of the soul weakens. The individual becomes increasingly controlled by impulse and ego. The result is inner fragmentation. The unjust person may appear powerful in public, but internally they become unstable. Their desires multiply faster than they can satisfy them. Their pride becomes hypersensitive to criticism. Their anger becomes easier to provoke. They lose control of themselves. This loss of control is the true punishment of injustice. Plato's view directly challenges a cynical belief that often appears in human societies. The belief that injustice can be advantageous if one escapes external punishment. According to Plato, this belief misunderstands the deeper consequences of action. The real damage occurs inside the soul. Each decision either strengthens harmony or deepens fragmentation. Each action trains the internal structure of the person. Over time, these choices accumulate into character. Virtue, therefore, becomes the most practical strategy for a stable life, not because society demands it, but because the soul requires it. The individual who cultivates virtue develops resilience against external chaos. Fortune may rise or fall. Reputation may fluctuate. Circumstances may change dramatically. Yet the inner structure remains intact. Reason continues guiding decisions. Spirit continues defending integrity. Appetite continues operating within limits. Such a person carries stability wherever they go. In contrast, a person without inner harmony depends heavily on external conditions. When success arrives, they feel confident. When success disappears, they collapse. Their identity fluctuates with circumstances because their internal structure lacks cohesion. This is why Plato associates virtue with freedom. A person enslaved by appetite is not free. Their cravings dictate their behavior. A person enslaved by pride is not free. Their need for recognition traps them in endless competition. Freedom emerges only when reason governs the soul. The rational individual can examine desires before obeying them. They can evaluate anger before expressing it. They can choose actions based on understanding rather than compulsion. Freedom becomes the ability to direct one's own life according to truth rather than impulse. This vision of virtue demands a deeper form of education than most societies provide. Education often focuses on transmitting information or developing technical skills. Plato believes the most important task of education is shaping the structure of the soul. Young minds must learn how to recognize their own internal forces. They must learn discipline over appetite and clarity in judgment. They must learn to direct the energy of spirit toward courage rather than aggression. Without such formation, the soul remains vulnerable to imbalance. Plato therefore sees moral development not as a secondary concern, but as the foundation of civilization. A society composed of individuals lacking inner harmony will inevitably drift toward instability. Greed will dominate economic life. Pride will dominate politics. Pleasure will dominate culture. The result will be a restless society filled with stimulation, yet lacking meaning. Modern observers often notice this tension. Despite unprecedented technological advancement, many individuals report feelings of emptiness or disorientation. Opportunities multiply, yet direction becomes unclear. Plato's diagnosis reaches across centuries. A culture can expand its power over the external world while neglecting the inner architecture of the soul. And when the inner architecture weakens, individuals begin searching for something stronger than pleasure or recognition. They begin asking deeper questions about the purpose of life and the structure of authority. If virtue creates harmony within the soul, who should guide a society composed of many souls seeking that harmony? Power without wisdom corrupts the soul of a city. Most societies pursue strength, wealth, and influence, as if these qualities alone guarantee stability. Plato dismantles this belief with ruthless clarity. A society ruled by ambition alone will eventually devour itself. Authority must be guided by understanding, or power becomes another form of appetite. This realization emerges naturally from everything already uncovered about the human soul. If justice within the individual requires reason to govern spirit and appetite, then the same structure must apply to society. The city is not separate from the soul. It is the soul expanded across thousands of individuals. When appetite dominates individuals, greed spreads. When pride dominates individuals, rivalry spreads. If these same forces dominate leadership, the political order begins reflecting the same instability that exists within fragmented souls. Plato therefore arrives at a radical conclusion. Those who truly understand reality should govern, not the richest, not the most charismatic, not the most popular. Those who have trained their minds to recognize truth beyond appearances. Those who have disciplined their souls until reason governs their actions. These are the philosophers. The claim sounds dangerous at first. Throughout history, philosophers have rarely held power. Kings rule. Generals command armies. Politicians maneuver through alliances. Philosophers usually remain observers, critics, or teachers. Plato understands this tension perfectly. His proposal does not emerge from naive idealism. It emerges from a brutal diagnosis of political failure. When power belongs to those driven primarily by appetite, corruption follows. Leaders driven by appetite pursue wealth, luxury, and personal advantage. Public resources become tools for private enrichment. Laws are twisted to protect privilege. Institutions become hollow shells, protecting those who already possess power. When power belongs to those driven primarily by spirit, conflict follows. Leaders driven by pride crave recognition, dominance, and historical legacy. They pursue glory even when the cost is destruction. War becomes attractive. Rivalry becomes permanent. National pride becomes a weapon rather than a source of stability. In both cases, reason becomes secondary. Plato therefore asks a question few societies are willing to confront. If leadership shapes the destiny of an entire community, should leadership not belong to those who understand the nature of justice itself? This is the origin of the philosopher-ruler. The philosopher-ruler is not simply a thinker who enjoys abstract ideas. In Plato's vision, the philosopher has undergone a transformation of the soul. They have moved beyond the illusions of the cave. They have disciplined appetite and pride. They have trained their reason through years of study, dialogue, and reflection. Most importantly, they have encountered the structure of truth itself. The philosopher understands that power is not an opportunity for self-gratification. It is a responsibility grounded in knowledge. Just as a physician guides the body toward health, the philosopher-ruler guides the city toward justice. This analogy reveals Plato's deeper logic. We trust trained specialists in nearly every domain of life. We allow engineers to design bridges because they understand structural principles. We allow doctors to perform surgery because they understand the body. Yet when it comes to governing societies, many systems allow leadership to emerge through popularity, wealth, or manipulation. Plato finds this contradiction absurd. Governing a city requires understanding the nature of justice, human psychology, and social harmony. It requires the capacity to see beyond short-term interests and personal advantage. In other words, it requires philosophical wisdom. But Plato also recognizes a psychological paradox. Those who crave power are often the least suited to wield it. Individuals driven by appetite seek authority for the privileges it brings. Individuals driven by pride seek authority for the recognition it provides. In both cases, power becomes a tool for satisfying inner impulses. The philosopher stands apart from this pattern. Because the philosopher's life is oriented toward truth rather than dominance, their deepest motivation is understanding. Power appears burdensome rather than attractive, and precisely for that reason, they may be the only ones capable of using it responsibly. The philosopher-ruler does not pursue leadership for personal glory. They accept it as a duty necessary to preserve justice within the community. This idea introduces a profound tension. Philosophers seek contemplation. Politics demands action. Philosophers pursue truth in quiet reflection. Political life requires constant engagement with conflict and compromise. Plato acknowledges this tension, but refuses to accept it as permanent. He believes education can prepare individuals capable of navigating both worlds. The training of philosopher-rulers becomes the central task of a just society. Young minds with intellectual potential must undergo years of rigorous formation. They must study mathematics to sharpen their reasoning. They must practice dialectic to expose illusions. They must examine ethics, psychology, and the structure of the soul. But intellectual training alone is not sufficient. The future rulers must also discipline their appetites and ambitions. They must live modestly, free from the temptations of wealth and luxury that corrupt judgment. They must learn to prioritize the good of the whole community over personal advancement. Through this long education, the soul becomes balanced. Reason grows strong. Spirit becomes loyal to truth rather than pride. Appetite becomes restrained. Only individuals who achieve this internal harmony should be entrusted with political authority. Plato understands that such leaders will be rare. Most people will not pursue the demanding path of philosophical discipline. Many will prefer the easier rewards of wealth or recognition. Yet the stability of the city depends on ensuring that the few who achieve wisdom are placed in positions where their insight can guide collective life. This vision challenges the political assumptions that dominate many societies. Modern systems often treat leadership as a competition of persuasion. Candidates appeal to public emotions, promises, and identities. Popularity becomes the currency of power. But popularity does not guarantee wisdom. A crowd may admire confidence more than understanding. They may reward rhetoric rather than reflection. They may select leaders who mirror their desires rather than challenge them. Plato warns that such systems risk amplifying the very forces that destabilize the soul. If citizens driven by appetite choose leaders who promise pleasure and consumption, the political order drifts toward corruption. If citizens driven by pride choose leaders who promise glory and dominance, the political order drifts toward conflict. The philosopher-ruler stands as a counterweight to these impulses. Their authority derives not from emotional appeal, but from knowledge. Their legitimacy emerges from understanding the structure of justice itself. Yet Plato never suggests that philosophers rule alone. A healthy society still requires producers, soldiers, artisans, and administrators. Each group performs its function within the larger structure. The philosopher-ruler provides orientation. They ensure that the city's institutions reflect harmony rather than chaos. The structure mirrors the soul. Reason governs. Spirit defends. Appetite sustains material life. When these roles align, the city approaches justice. But Plato also understands that political authority cannot solve every human problem. Even in a just city, individuals still face the deeper questions of existence. Wealth, recognition, and even justice within society do not fully answer the mystery of human life. Because beneath political order lies an even more fundamental question. What becomes of the soul itself beyond the boundaries of the body? The soul is not destroyed by death. It simply leaves the stage where the body once stood. Most human beings live as if existence begins at birth and collapses at the grave. But Plato rejects this assumption with relentless certainty. If the soul is the source of reason, truth, and moral order, then it cannot belong entirely to a body that decays. Something that grasps eternal realities cannot itself be entirely temporary. This idea forces the mind to confront a disturbing question. If the soul survives the body, what exactly is this life we are living now? Plato suggests something radical. The life we experience may not be the beginning of consciousness, but only one chapter in a much longer journey. Birth does not create the soul, it reveals it. Death does not destroy the soul, it releases it. To understand this claim, Plato returns to a principle already revealed earlier. True knowledge concerns realities that do not change. The forms remain stable, eternal, untouched by time. Justice does not decay. Beauty does not age. Truth does not collapse when civilizations vanish. Yet the human mind can recognize these eternal structures. This fact alone creates a philosophical tension. How can a temporary being grasp something permanent? The senses certainly cannot do it. Everything the senses touch changes constantly. Objects deteriorate, bodies weaken, empires rise and collapse. The physical world moves in endless cycles of transformation, yet reason can still recognize patterns that remain unchanged. This suggests that the soul participates in something deeper than physical experience. Plato proposes that knowledge may not be learning in the usual sense. It may be remembering. The soul, before entering the body, may have encountered the forms directly. In that state, it perceived truth without the distortions of sense perception. But when the soul enters the physical world, memory fades. The shock of embodiment overwhelms its clarity. Life becomes a gradual recollection. Education does not insert truth into the mind. It awakens what the soul already contains in hidden form. The philosopher therefore becomes not a collector of information, but a guide, helping the soul remember its deeper origin. This idea appears strange at first glance, yet Plato supports it through observation of human cognition. When we encounter a perfectly reasoned mathematical proof, something inside the mind recognizes its necessity. The mind does not treat it as mere opinion. It experiences the conclusion as unavoidable. The same occurs with moral insight. When we encounter genuine justice or genuine beauty, the mind responds with recognition rather than surprise. We do not treat justice as a random invention. We feel that justice corresponds to something real, something our minds already expect the world to reflect. Plato interprets this experience as evidence that the soul carries traces of a deeper encounter with truth. But this philosophical speculation leads toward an even more serious implication. If the soul existed before this life and continues after it, then human existence becomes morally charged in a way that ordinary thinking rarely acknowledges. Life becomes preparation. The choices made during one's time in the body shape the condition of the soul itself. Each action strengthens either harmony or disorder within the inner structure of the person. These patterns do not disappear when the body dies. The soul carries them forward. This idea transforms ethical behavior from a social obligation into an existential necessity. Justice is no longer simply beneficial for maintaining order within society. It becomes essential for preserving the integrity of the soul across the entire arc of its existence. Plato, therefore, views philosophy as preparation for death. This phrase does not express despair. It expresses clarity. Most people fear death because they identify themselves entirely with the body. If the body dissolves, they believe the self disappears with it. The philosopher views the situation differently. The body is a temporary environment through which the soul moves. Philosophical life gradually detaches the soul from blind dependence on bodily impulses. Appetite becomes moderated. Pride becomes disciplined. Reason becomes stronger. The individual learns to evaluate desires rather than obey them automatically. Through this process, the soul becomes less enslaved to the body. When death arrives, the philosopher does not experience the same panic as someone who has spent an entire life attached to physical pleasure and social recognition. The philosopher has already begun orienting the soul towards something deeper than the body. In contrast, a soul dominated by appetite faces death with terror. If pleasure defines existence, the loss of the body appears catastrophic. The individual clings desperately to life because their identity depends entirely on sensory satisfaction. Similarly, a soul dominated by pride resists death violently. Recognition, status, and influence vanish with the collapse of the body. The ego experiences death as humiliation. But the soul shaped by reason experiences something different. Because reason has always pointed beyond appearances, it has always sought truth rather than temporary satisfaction. The philosopher, therefore, approaches death with curiosity rather than pure fear. Death becomes a transition rather than annihilation. Plato illustrates this idea through mythic imagery describing the journey of the soul after death. Souls leave the physical world carrying the moral structure they built during life. Those who cultivated justice moved toward greater clarity and harmony. Those who cultivated injustice carry the weight of disorder. The myth is not simply religious storytelling. It functions as philosophical psychology. The soul cannot escape its own structure. Every decision made during life becomes part of that structure. Each act of honesty strengthens reason. Each act of corruption strengthens appetite or pride. Over time, the soul becomes shaped by its own habits. Death removes the body, but leaves the soul exactly as it has been formed. This realization forces the individual to confront responsibility in a deeper way than ordinary morality demands. One cannot hide from oneself. External reputation can be manipulated. Laws can be evaded. Public image can be constructed carefully. But the internal structure of the soul records every decision. In the end, the individual becomes what they repeatedly choose. This insight returns us to the philosophical journey described from the beginning. The prisoner who leaves the cave begins seeing reality more clearly. The individual who cultivates justice begins harmonizing the forces within the soul. The philosopher who pursues truth begins loosening the grip of illusion. These transformations prepare the soul for something beyond the immediate concerns of daily life. Yet Plato never allows the philosophical journey to remain abstract. Understanding the immortality of the soul leads to another practical question. If the soul carries its structure beyond death, how should a society educate its citizens so that their souls turn toward truth rather than illusion? Education does not fill the mind, it turns the soul. Most societies believe education means transferring information from teacher to student, as if the mind were an empty container waiting to be filled. Plato rejects this entire assumption. Knowledge cannot simply be inserted. Truth must be discovered through a transformation of perception itself. The human soul already carries the capacity for understanding. It already contains the rational element capable of recognizing truth. Yet this capacity often remains dormant because the soul is facing the wrong direction. Education, therefore, becomes a reorientation. The mind must turn away from appearances and toward reality. This idea grows directly from the earlier image of the cave. The prisoners staring at shadows are not blind. Their eyes function perfectly. The problem lies in where those eyes are directed. They face the wall rather than the source of light. The same condition exists in ordinary life. People spend enormous effort interpreting the shadows of social approval, material success, and cultural expectations. They compete for recognition. They pursue pleasure. They imitate the desires circulating through their environment. Yet rarely do they question whether these pursuits point towards something real. Education must intervene at this precise point. The role of the educator is not to impose beliefs, but to guide the turning of the soul. The teacher helps the student rotate their attention away from illusion and toward deeper patterns. This process cannot be forced. A soul dragged toward truth will resist it. The movement must arise from the student's own awakening. Plato, therefore, places enormous importance on the structure of education. Children should not be exposed immediately to the most complex philosophical ideas. Their souls must first develop stability. Music, storytelling, and physical training shape the emotional and spirited elements of the young mind. These early influences create sensitivity to harmony and courage. Without such preparation, reason cannot grow properly. If a young soul becomes addicted to pleasure or overwhelmed by uncontrolled pride, the rational element struggles to establish authority later in life. The early formation of character becomes essential. But Plato is equally careful about the stories societies tell their children. Stories shape imagination before reason awakens. They plant images of courage, justice, betrayal, and heroism inside the young mind. If those images glorify deception, cruelty, or reckless ambition, they distort the moral instincts of the soul. Education must therefore protect the developing mind from narratives that normalize disorder. This claim often surprises modern readers who celebrate unrestricted expression. Yet, Plato's concern is psychological rather than authoritarian. The young mind absorbs patterns unconsciously. Before reason matures, imagination becomes the architect of character. Once the soul grows stronger, education can introduce more demanding disciplines. Mathematics becomes essential because it trains the mind to think beyond sensory experience. Numbers do not appear directly in the physical world. They exist as abstract structures. By studying them, the student begins learning how to move from appearances toward underlying order. Geometry sharpens the same skill. When the mind examines the properties of shapes, it discovers relationships that remain constant regardless of physical imperfections. A triangle drawn on paper may wobble, but the rational structure of the triangle remains precise. Through this process, the student becomes accustomed to recognizing truths that do not depend on sensory perception. Astronomy follows, but not as a collection of observations about stars. Plato believes astronomy should train the mind to recognize mathematical harmony within the movement of the cosmos. The student begins to see that reality contains order deeper than immediate perception reveals. Each discipline serves the same purpose. The soul slowly turns towards structure rather than appearance. But the highest stage of education arrives later through dialectic. Here, the student confronts ideas directly. Concepts such as justice, truth, beauty, and goodness undergo relentless examination. Assumptions collapse. Contradictions appear. The mind learns how to separate opinion from knowledge. Dialectic sharpens reason into its most powerful form. Yet Plato insists that not every student should reach this stage too early. A young mind trained in dialectic without moral stability can become destructive. Instead of seeking truth, it may begin using argument purely to dominate others. Pride can corrupt reason if the soul remains unbalanced. This warning reveals Plato's deeper understanding of human psychology. Knowledge alone does not guarantee wisdom. A brilliant mind governed by appetite or pride becomes dangerous. Intelligence amplifies the impulses already dominating the soul. Only when reason governs spirit and appetite can intellectual power serve justice rather than ambition. For this reason, the highest philosophical education is reserved for those who have demonstrated both intellectual capacity and moral discipline. These individuals undergo years of study, reflection, and practical experience within the city. They learn how institutions function, how human desires influence political life, and how fragile justice can become when leaders pursue personal advantage. Only after this long preparation do they return fully to philosophical contemplation. The purpose of this education is not personal prestige. It prepares individuals capable of guiding the soul of the city itself. When philosopher rulers emerge from this formation, their authority does not rest on popularity or inheritance. It rests on understanding. They have trained their minds to perceive the forms, especially the highest principle among them, the form of the good. The good is the source that illuminates all other truths. Just as the sun allows the eyes to see physical objects, the good allows the mind to recognize justice, beauty, and truth. Without it, knowledge remains fragmented. The philosopher who perceives the good gains orientation for every decision. Power no longer appears as a means of domination, but as a responsibility to maintain harmony. Laws become instruments for cultivating virtue rather than protecting privilege. Education becomes the central pillar of political life. Because the stability of the city depends entirely on the formation of its citizens. A society that neglects education gradually drifts back toward the cave. Citizens become absorbed in appearances. Leaders chase popularity rather than wisdom. Institutions become tools for satisfying appetite and pride. The shadows return. In the era of 2025, the urgency of this problem has become visible again. Information spreads faster than understanding. Attention fragments under the pressure of endless stimulation. Education often focuses on technical efficiency while neglecting the deeper formation of character and judgment. Plato's warning echoes across centuries. A civilization can become technologically advanced while remaining philosophically immature. When that happens, individuals accumulate power without understanding how to use it wisely. Knowledge multiplies, but wisdom declines. The result is a society capable of extraordinary achievements, yet uncertain about its own direction. Education must therefore recover its deeper purpose, not merely producing workers, not merely producing specialists. It must cultivate souls capable of recognizing truth beyond appearance, souls capable of disciplining appetite and pride, souls capable of using reason as the guiding force of life. Such education does not end with formal schooling. The turning of the soul continues throughout existence. Every experience invites reflection. Every challenge reveals something about the structure of the self. The philosophical life remains a continuous process of aligning the soul with truth. And as the soul turns further toward that light, the individual begins to recognize a final and unsettling realization. The journey toward wisdom never truly ends. It only deepens, drawing the mind beyond the limits of ordinary thought toward questions that remain waiting just beyond the horizon of understanding. Philosophy begins where illusion breaks. What Plato reveals through his entire system is not merely a theory about reality, but a confrontation with the deepest structure of human existence. The world we see is unstable. The senses are limited, and the mind easily mistakes appearance for truth. Yet, within the human soul, there exists a force capable of reaching beyond these shadows. That force is reason. From the recognition of eternal forms to the allegory of the cave, from the distinction between belief and knowledge to the disciplined method of dialectic, Plato constructs a path that leads the human mind away from illusion and toward understanding. This path does not promise comfort. It demands intellectual courage. It demands that the individual question inherited assumptions, examine the structure of the soul, and confront the possibility that much of what society accepts as reality may only be reflection and imitation. At the center of this philosophical journey stands the human soul itself. Plato insists that the condition of the soul determines everything. Justice in society cannot exist without justice within the individual. A city becomes ordered only when its citizens cultivate harmony between reason, spirit, and desire. When reason governs, courage supports, and appetite accepts discipline, the individual life becomes balanced. From that balance emerges virtue, and from virtue emerges genuine happiness. This understanding transforms ethics from a system of rules into a form of inner architecture. Injustice is not merely harmful to others, it fractures the soul of the person who commits it. Virtue, by contrast, restores harmony and allows the human being to live with coherence and freedom. The good life, therefore, depends not on wealth, reputation, or power, but on the internal order of the mind. Plato extends this insight to the structure of society itself. Political authority cannot be guided by appetite or ambition without eventually collapsing into corruption or conflict. Power must be guided by wisdom. The philosopher-ruler symbolizes this principle. Those who understand truth should guide those who remain entangled in appearances. Leadership grounded in knowledge becomes the safeguard of justice. Yet Plato's philosophy does not stop at the boundaries of political life. He turns the gaze further inward and further beyond. The soul, capable of grasping eternal truths, cannot be reduced to the temporary body that houses it. Human life becomes a stage in a much larger journey. The choices made within this life shape the condition of the soul itself. Justice and wisdom therefore carry consequences that extend beyond immediate existence. From this perspective, education becomes the most important task of civilization. Education is not the mechanical transfer of knowledge, but the turning of the soul toward truth. It trains reason, disciplines desire, and cultivates the courage required to face reality without illusion. Through education, the individual gradually leaves the darkness of the cave and learns to recognize the light that makes understanding possible. Plato's philosophy, therefore, functions as an invitation. It calls human beings to awaken from intellectual complacency. It challenges them to examine the structure of their beliefs, the balance of their desires, and the direction of their lives. The questions Plato asked thousands of years ago remain unresolved because they reach into the permanent dilemmas of human existence. What is real? What is just? What kind of life is truly worth living? These questions do not disappear with time. They follow every generation, waiting for individuals willing to confront them. And in that confrontation, the purpose of philosophy becomes clear. Philosophy is not an abstract competition of arguments. It is the discipline that forces the human mind to wake up in a world filled with shadows.